The opening chapters of the Fullmetal Alchemist manga form arguably the best opening act of the entire medium. The carefully calculated structure of these episodic and lighthearted stories do a perfect job of lulling the reader into a false sense of security, all the while that grim opening page and subtle allusions to a greater disturbance fall to the back of the reader's mind. This comes to a head with one of the most infamous stories in manga, a staggering example of narrative subversion. It not only acts as the breaking point where the harshness of the world is put front and center, but also acts as a catalyst for the following story as the world begins to fill out and grow in scope. It's a genuinely phenomenal 6 opening chapters, and the structure that made it work so well never made it to either anime adaptation. How? How was one of the sharpest openings in all of fiction passed up not by 1, but 2 adaptation teams? It seems utterly outlandish from the outset, yet derives from entirely believable, albeit deeply frustrating, development circumstances. In Fullmetal Alchemist 2003's case, calling it an adaptation is somewhat unfair in the first place. It'd be more accurate to call it a Fullmetal Alchemist AU fanfiction that just happened to be done by some of the anime industry's best and brightest. That probably comes off as an insult, but I genuinely mean nothing of the sort. I love 2003, maybe even more than the manga. Which, if anything, speaks to the potential quality of AUs, I guess. Back on topic, Brotherhood was meant to be a fairly direct adaptation of the manga, and eventually did become that and then some. However, as I discussed in the project introduction video, Brotherhood didn't start this way. Instead, due to a perfect storm of production issues, Brotherhood began with an anime original episode, followed by a portion of the backstory severed and sent back about 10 episodes from where it would have been in a manga-accurate adaptation. This is followed by a now redundant and sometimes laughably poor adaptation of the Lior chapters. It then skips the mining town and train battle entirely, at least for the time being for the former, before waltzing into the Sho Tucker storyline without any of the build-up the manga had. This is a mess. It's less of an artistic vision and more a case of damage control for a series that had the odds stacked against it by any measure. It's only made more frustrating when you watch episode 4 of Brotherhood and find out it's good? No, seriously, it's well directed, well paced, doesn't butcher anything the manga did, and even benefits a little from the exaggerated humor. Without the needed context, though, it just doesn't land like it should. Episodes 5 and 6 are similar, and almost convince you that Brotherhood is finding its footing, before episode 7 comes along and promptly stomps this optimism with its first non-recap scene. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The focus for today is just on these 6 episodes, and what we can do to make them function as a worthy adaptation of the manga chapters. And really, it's just about these 5, seeing as episode 1 has already been covered. With that in mind, let's get into FMABR, episode 2. Starting us off, Brotherhood's official second episode, First Day, is getting shifted back to where it belongs at episode 12. There is more to it than that, but I'll save that discussion for the dub with our breakdown. This leaves us with 2 slots since Brotherhood episode 1 is going into an entirely new role. Funnily enough, these 2 slots work perfectly for reincorporating the 2 manga stories cut from official Broho. At the same time, however, this puts episodes 2 and 3 into a unique position, as the material they're composed of is entirely from the 2003 anime, short of the opening, ending, and bumpers. This led to some odd technical issues, but we'll save that side of the equation for later in the video. For now, let's focus on what cuts were made and why from a narrative perspective. Looking at 2003 episode 9, the episode from which we get all our main footage, the opening scene with Winry has been removed. This is a classic case of previous narrative threads no longer being present to weave in, as this introduction exists to bridge this episode with the last one. And as is the case with this entire flashback arc of the 2003 anime, none of that context, that connective tissue, is compatible with the manga timeline. This also means we don't see Ed get his assignment or Mustang's initial reason for giving it to him. He expresses this later in the episode, so it doesn't cause any loose ends, thankfully, but does alter our starting point considerably. Case in point, there is no pre-OP scene for episode 2, with the side of the train heading to Usewell now acting as our first scene proper. While the interaction between Ed and Al had to be cut once again for context, the unsettling lack of train passengers still works as a small opening hook. It's from this point that no major deviations occur for a while. There is a small cut where Al originally explained that they were broke because of Winry, but it's so quick you might not even catch its absence. Similarly, Ed referencing Winry while oiling his automail was also cut. I did consider keeping this one, but ultimately felt that Winry, and really any connections the brothers have to their home, were really best kept to after the Chimera incident. One could argue that the OP and ending damage this by giving us scenes with these characters, but I'd argue these glances into them are quick and subtle enough that they create more questions than they answer. A good thing in this case. Back to the episode, we keep going and run into the first 2003 original element that was kept: Lyra. Lyra is considerably more important in later 2003 material, but this is her first appearance in anything and is pretty baked into the plot of this episode. Frankly though, I like what she adds to this episode irrespective of how it involves later events that won't happen in this timeline. She gives Ed a chance to technobabble about alchemy quickly, and gives him an opponent that's at least ostensibly intimidating in combat for the climax. No notes. This is a very solid change from the source material. And hey, a cameo in a later episode could be possible in an FMABR 2.0 someday. Anywho, the next cut is made after the episode bumpers, as the scene with General Hakuro announcing Mustang's transfer has been removed. I elected to keep the circumstances regarding Mustang fairly vague for this early section of the story, only verifying his role upon Ed's arrival at Eastern HQ in episode 4. More on this later. The episode continues uninterrupted from Yoki's dinner all the way to the scene at the ashes of Uswell Inn. Following the home and coffin line, Ed originally had a few lines of dialogue directed at Al that included a mention of them burning down their home. This detail is not intended to be shared with the audience until the brothers return to Resemble, so these lines had to be cut. From here, the episode runs uncut from Ed transmuting gold, all the way to Hawkeye giving Mustang Ed's report. I mentioned this scene not because it was changed per se, but because this scene is now the very first the audience gets with these two in the entire series, and its presence is nonetheless a manga deviation. In the manga, we don't meet any members of the Mustang unit until this page during the following chapter. This introduction is sharp for what it is, but I also think the small insight into Roy and Risa's dynamic works just as well here. And besides, given the footage I had to work with, this was the closest I could get to what the manga was going for when it came to introducing these folks. The last cut of the episode was another example of context removal, as this scene acts as a bookend for 2003's flashback arc. I want to state that my choice to cut a scene doesn't mean that I didn't like it. On the contrary, I love a couple of these scenes, but just acknowledge that they belong as 2003 only. They'll get a chance to shine eventually once we get to FMA 3R. Continuing narratively, episode 3 ends up hitting a weird spot. Unlike 2003's take on the mining town, Battle on the Train was radically changed in regards to its placement in the timeline. In 2003's context, Ed is not a state alchemist during these events, and also isn't going to East City to check in with Mustang. Instead, he's meeting Mustang in Central City for a chance at taking the alchemy exam. Between this and the change to the Gates properties in 2003, we end up with about twice as many context-sensitive interactions to either rework or cut. In practice, this episode literally never tells you where the brothers are going, or why. Sure, this gets told to the audience eventually in episode 4, but it's still weird that the episode where the train ride happens never tells us why the brothers were even on it. Ideally, I'd have a custom title card to indicate that the train is heading for Eastern Command, as any other setup couldn't really be done without extra dialogue. I did almost use the opening from 2003 episode 10 to fill people in on this context, but by this point in 2003, Ed and Mustang's relationship had already deviated too much from the source material for that to work. Ed's antagonism towards Mustang here just doesn't fit with the duo we'll see in the following episode. Back to 2003 episode 5 though, the source for all the footage found in this cut, the pre-OP scene of the brothers being directed onto the train by Mustang has been cut, as well as the follow-up scene with Ed, Al, and Marin. As you may have guessed, these were cut due to their dependence on 2003 exclusive story beats. So, just like the previous episode, we start with an establishing shot from later in the official episode. In this case, that's an establishing shot of the train going over water. Not long after, we have another cut, this one perhaps being the most significant: Hughes' introduction. This was an especially difficult cut, what with it being the perfect introduction to him and all, but it once again works through contexts that were unable to carry over. Thankfully, there are few other cuts remotely as painful as this one left to cover from any episode in this re-edit. The next scene of note isn't actually a cut, but rather a 2003 exclusive element kept in. Mustang knew about the train hijacking. In 2003, Mustang specifically has Ed go on a suspect train in the hopes something bad would happen that Ed could play hero in stopping. This is a remarkably cold and calculated decision that showcases Mustang's 2003 characterization to the audience in speedy fashion. It's great characterization work, but plays completely differently now that we've moved it back to a manga-accurate place in the timeline. In the manga, Ed being on the train was pure coincidence. Mustang was caught off guard by it and saved by the pure dumb luck that was Ed being on board. I really like this moment of characterization as an introduction to Mustang. It tells us that he's respected by his fellow officers as a figure of authority during crises like this, and also quickly tells us that even someone as high-ranking as him has a lot of respect and trust in Ed. With FMABR, I had no method of adapting this take on the story. Instead, we end up somewhere in the middle, or at least you'd think so. As it turns out, having Roy know Ed is on the train affects the manga's handling of the story very little, because Ed is already a state alchemist. Of course Ed can handle these sorts of dangerous situations. He's been doing it for years at this point and been doing it well, at least as far as we know. Not having Ed in the loop is kind of a weird choice, but given how Bald quickly targeted the soldiers he was able to know about, it ended up being a really clever move in the end. Would I ideally use the manga's opening act for all this? Sure. Is this setup satisfactory in its characterization? Absolutely. Outside of these smaller examples, little else is cut from this episode until this moment of Ed almost getting knocked off by gunfire. This was pretty easily changed to an off-screen use of clap alchemy. The final example of cut material happens at the end, where Ed's confrontation of Mustang over his plan is cut off because of, what else? Context conflicts. Beyond this, the episode really isn't changed that much, and still leads into the next episode well enough. It's at about this point where a detractor might ask a fair question of me. Was this worth it? You poked and prodded at these 2 episodes, removed numerous scenes that you yourself enjoyed, all just for structural integrity? And viewing it in this way isn't wrong. In an ideal world, I would have had a more solid opening scene for the train battle with a more manga-accurate take on Ed's conversation with Al at the start of 2003 episode 10. Besides that though, these small compromises add up to just 8 minutes of lost footage between both of these episodes. That's really not half bad given the circumstances, and the episodes themselves are still perfectly watchable. And beyond the points about manga accuracy, these 3 episodes are just plain more entertaining and structurally sound than the official Brotherhood's first 3. And at least for me, that's enough to say, yes, it was worth it. However, seeing how the next few episodes play out may help those who aren't convinced just yet. With that in mind, we head into episode 4, An Alchemist's Anguish. In stark contrast to the first 3 episodes, we're finally in the first official episode of Brotherhood that's, good. And that's pretty lucky for us, since 2003's take on the story, brilliant as it is at points, was not compatible with the manga at all here. And seeing as many 2003 fans were probably disappointed by my choice to use Brotherhood's take on it, I feel the need to elaborate on why. First, the alchemy exam. 2003 places the Show Tucker story beat smack dab in the middle of its flashback arc, meaning that the reason for Ed and Al's visit is already completely different and incompatible. Second, the birthday party. Between Alicia not being born yet and Ed not yet understanding the mechanics of clap alchemy, this section of the story is also incompatible. Third, Scar. Scar's flashback characterization in 2003 isn't compatible with his manga introduction, or even his flashback characterization in the manga. Fourth, Boss Grand. Just like Scar, 2003's characterization of General Grand isn't compatible with the manga. And finally, fifth, Barry the Chopper. Following Nina's death, and foreshadowed before it, 2003 Ed had a run-in with a still-alive Barry the Chopper. This isn't compatible with later material in Lab 5 and the Maria Ross hoax. In short, putting this arc back in time affected this portion way more than it affected the train battle, and especially the mining town. However, that doesn't mean we can't take a couple of cues from it. For example, this sequence with the Hughes family mirrors an anime original scene from Brotherhood's official episode 1. By shuffling Boss Grand vs. Scar from the start of episode 4 to the start of episode 5, and by replacing the scene of Hughes and Armstrong going over the files for said case with the Elric staying over at Hughes' place, we end up with easily the sharpest episode so far. Dare I say it, we end up with a version of the story that's better paced than its manga counterpart. And hey, we at least indirectly have 2003 to thank for that being the case. The rest of episode 4 goes unchanged, at least narratively. Episode 5 is less lean when it comes to 2003 material, but not by much. This episode starts the way official episode 4 does, with Boss Gron vs. Scar. This was done for the sake of my preference for Scar being introduced after the Chimera incident, rather than before. This was important to episode 4 maintaining its sense of security, as Gron's battle abilities make Ed out to be outclassed from the get-go. Since Ed is still firmly a wish fulfillment character up to this point, I really didn't want this muddying that. Keeping the fight at all was up in the air initially, as including it necessitated a scene with Führer King Bradley. His first scene. In the manga, we don't even see Bradley until he checks up on Ed after the Lab 5 incident, and this works to great effect for disarming the audience. Having him be so serious here doesn't exactly gel with that. However, I was willing to let this brief introduction slide for 2 reasons. 1, I really like this fight between General Gron and Scar. It's well choreographed, shows off alchemy that we won't see again until the Ishval flashbacks, and does a lot to sell just how powerful Scar is, something we do want now that Ed's had his time as a wish fulfillment character brought to a screeching halt. 2, this scene with Bradley adds some extra weight to Scar as a priority for the government. In the manga, we don't get a strong sense of this until after he recovers from the attack in the sewers. I always found that strange given how many fatalities he caused prior to that. The scene with Hughes talking to Roy about it does arguably do enough for this on its own, but having the most powerful man in the land show up adds a lot of credence to this. Especially since we haven't been told Hughes is head of the court-martial office yet. Wait a minute. Are we never told this? Huh. Turns out this is only confirmed in 2003 and is never stated in the manga or broho. Weird. Anyhow, the remainder of the episode is unchanged until this cut from Lust and Envy's conversation to May's and Roy's. Rather than use the official cut scene for this, I ended up using 2003's equivalent scene. Why? Because my oh-so-genius move to have Ed stay at Hughes' place during episode 4 backfired on me. But only a little. See, Hughes was stationed at Central Command at this point in the series, but moved to Eastern Command, which is why he was on the train, because of the Scar case. We aren't told about this at the time, of course, but this is the rationale behind him both being on the train and staying in the East, only to be moved back to Central when Scar killings abruptly dry up. However, this means Hughes knows Ed is in the East, because he's been staying the night with him and his family. And this information makes these 2 lines,
"You and Tucker are the only state alchemist of note in this area, right?"
Oh no.
completely unworkable. The 2003 lines are a bit more vague and imply that Hughes and Mustang are already moving to Scar's position, thereby making them look fairly competent at their jobs, and not like total nincompoops in the new context. After all, Roy isn't supposed to do that till later. The only problem this scene causes is that Hughes says his daughter is already 3 in the dub, but almost 3 in the sub. Sub is correct in this case, as Alicia turns 3 during episode 9, but it's a minor enough detail in the dub that it probably won't ruffle too many feathers compared to, gross negligence. From the cut back to Ed and Al sulking in the rain all the way to Scar's retreat from the battle with Armstrong, the official cut remains unchanged. Again, it's pretty solid stuff, so I didn't see a reason to mess with it. Until here. This scene might be the most infamous case of over-accentuated humor in the entire show. Maybe one of the worst in all of anime. Rather than follow the manga's lead and let Al's monologue carry the weight it ought to while keeping subtle gags in the background, we get funny spinning animations, wacky sound effects, and an immersion-breaking halt to the music. That was not gonna cut it. So I restitched some of the animations, borrowed some sound effects and a single voice line from 2003's take on the scene, unhalted the music, and voila, actual manga accuracy. Beyond this admittedly serious error, and that error of my own creation we just covered, this episode really didn't need any other work. It's a solid, well-directed adaptation of the manga chapter. And finally, we reach episode 6. Once again, this episode had very little change from its source, with only 3 changes from the official cut to speak of. The first involves this moment for Ed as he and Armstrong depart for Resin Bowl. It's a 2003 exclusive line that I appreciate for its strengthening of the bond between Ed and Hughes. The second involves a change to the Lior flashback during Ed's conversation with Dr. Marco. A couple quick shots from FMABR episode 1 did the job here just fine. And lastly, I replaced the scene of Armstrong being just a little too over the top after Ed gets home from visiting the remains of his old one, with a scene from the 2003 anime. I wanted to maintain the comedy that the Brotherhood cut was going for, but have it land a little better through a smidge more subtlety. It also comes with the added bonus of foreshadowing Winry's interest in Ed's pocket watch, a story beat that will come into play during Rush Valley. One could argue this is too much distance between story beats, but I think that, at worst, this creates a double-edged sword of a scene that is still an improvement over the alternative. Beyond these relatively small changes, the episode remains the same as the official cut, as can be said for the 2 episodes before it. The last thing to note is a missing piece from each of these episodes' official cuts: recap narration. For whatever reason, the Broho team elected to start episodes 4, 5, and 6 with recaps of the previous episodes, all of which feel narratively pointless. I can only assume these are here due to production constraints really taking their toll by this point, and I am thankful I was able to remove them. Come to think of it though, they could have been used as an excuse to minimize overlap with 2003. But that's just speculation. And with that, we're done covering the narrative side of the breakdowns. But, as you may have guessed, we're not done quite yet. Taking a cue from Kaiser Netko's later DBZA episode breakdowns, we're going to separate the technical side of these edits into groups, starting with lip flaps. This section is surprisingly light, as all line edits made to episodes 2, 3, 4, and 6 didn't end up needing new flaps. The closest I came to needing any was during episode 3, but even this managed to skate by without needing them through lucky desyncs that still matched their new voice lines. Episode 5, however, did. Remember that scene I incorporated from 2003 of Maze and Roy at the bar? I needed to cut this scene short, but still have it in with the bartender coming in for the phone call. So I extracted the flaps from that end shot and copied them to match the shot the dialogue was originally in to fit. Pretty simple stuff, honestly, since that meant I didn't have to freehand anything. Now then, on to visual edits. And we're still at this scene. Yeah, as it turns out, Hughes was still talking in the original scene when the bartender came into frame. Since these existing flaps didn't match, I had to do some simple masking to have her come in without affecting Hughes' new dialogue. It's a very simple edit, but very slick. Back to episodes 2 and 3, the most obvious visual edit is those bumpers. These were designed by me in an attempt to, if crudely, capture the aesthetic of the Brotherhood bumpers. No fancy trim, but you do get some admittedly slick portraits of characters taken straight from Cacao FMA. Ultimately though, I hope to at least commission a high-quality recreation of the official trim to put these in for the 2.0 releases. Whenever those happen, plans for that are still up in the air. A smaller visual edit shared by these 2 episodes is their title card. These are based on the unique style given to episode 13, Beasts of Doubleth. Given that I didn't have the skills or team members at the time to do one in the parchment style, this was a natural choice. It also came with the plus of not cutting off any footage unnecessarily. That said, I would like to commission something for episode 3 in the future that can help establish why the Elrics are on this train in the first place, and a title card displaying a map could be a valid solution to that. Episode 3 also had a small addition at the end of Ed's first conversation with Hughes due to limited footage, but it's really a blink it and you'll miss it kind of alteration. The same can be said for the shot of Edward recoiling after almost getting shot. I needed to extend it by just half a second, so I grabbed a small fraction at the end, reversed it, and seesawed it back until it met the join. If you look really closely, you can actually see the water moving in the wrong direction for about 2/3 of a second. Episode 4 is also a very light affair in this regard. A slight adjustment was made to the first scene transition timings due to the music crossfades no longer applying. The title card was reaffixed to after Mustang offers the boys the chance to talk with Tucker for the same reason. A single overhead city shot was grabbed from 2003 episode 13, as Brotherhood never actually gives us one of each city, just Central. This was color corrected by me, as even someone as green as me when it comes to color correcting tools can still handle a still, before crossfading into the portion of the episode taken from Brotherhood's official episode 1. This section also had a small change, as I cut down the short joke to achieve what I consider better comedic timing. I had to start this animation early and hold on the ending frame a little longer than in the original. Episode 5 may look pretty innocuous as well, but that's because pretty much all of it is concentrated on this one change. This edit required a similar seesawing between existing footage as we mentioned earlier, but this time needed the help of resampling to get the timing of the animation down. Episode 6 may be the lightest of the bunch, with the only changed footage coming down to that redone transition mentioned earlier, and a moved title card due to a removed opening recap. Now on to audio edits. Episode 2 featured a slightly different audio cut here between dubs. While the English mix used typical crossfades, the Japanese mix ended up with more of a gap due to the different line delivery. I ended up filling this gap with some background noise from the English mix's rear stereo channel. The cut after the home and coffin line included a pretty intricate crossfade in the music that vamps a little differently between dubs as well, although the goal was pretty much the same effect. Finally, the end sequence had Hawkeye's delivery pushed up a bit in the English mix due to it being too quiet originally. This music was also slightly extended so as to not keep the original fully. Episode 3's audio was utter chaos. So much so that it remains the only episode that needed separate video tracks for its Japanese and English dubs. You may have guessed that the timeline adjustment had something to do with this, given how the cast's military ranks were different at this point in 2003's story. And while that is true, this is significantly further complicated by each of these ranks having their own word in Japanese. Lieutenant is Chui, Lieutenant Colonel is Chusa, Colonel is Taisa, and you get the idea. This made a real mess of the audio at points, and eventually it became clear that the episode would simply need different video timings depending on the dub. Outside of this mess, the audio work was actually quite straightforward and involved little in post. The only exceptions were this edit in the music for the truncated scene of Ed creating the cannon, the theme of Amestris getting chopped up at a couple points during Mustang's lecture to Bald, and a unique music switch up for the end. The ending scene originally faded in music from 2003's ending theme, which meant I had to do some audio isolation trickery to remove it and paste in my own. The loop that advanced into the Brotherhood ending was taken from a studio mix of the same track, as it had a workable guitar riff at the end of the song that made for an effective loop. Oh, and lest I forget, both this episode and episode 2 needed the tuning fork sound effect thrown in whenever Ed used clap alchemy. Episode 4, as we briefly mentioned earlier, has the simplest audio timeline out of any of these episodes by far. With no 2003 audio to speak of and only a single piece of music added in post and faded into an existing scene, it could not be more simple. Episode 5 isn't much more complex, despite how it may look. Yes, the crossfades here are a little messy, but ultimately these are just ambience channels you'll barely even notice if you're actively trying to listen for them. The cuts are only where they are due to the stupid flying away fully needing to be worked around. Episode 6 only had one notable edit, as the track I had to cut off early used a mix that wasn't part of any OST album, meaning I had a remarkably narrow window to get the crossfade right. It's relatively hard to notice, and that's good enough for me since that's the bar for good sound work. I liked to give reframing its own section since it occupies a different place in editing compared to other visual edits. And besides that, reframing only applies to episodes 2 and 3 anyway. Episode 2 had a single non-parallel truck shot that was turned into a still for reframing in the 16:9 cut. Besides that, it was a very cut and dry approach with few compromises or weird motions to speak of. The only exceptional part of it was that this entire episode got this treatment. The same can be said for episode 3, although it didn't even manage one edited truck shot or notable motion. Sometimes reframing really is just that simple. Episodes 4, 5, and 6, as you may have guessed, have almost no reframing due to their limited use of 2003 footage. What is present isn't especially noteworthy. Instead, these episodes dealt with manual subs, a practice that saves inordinate time for the sub release, but is a little wonky in execution. If you've never tried it, you may not be aware, but SRT file creation is a real pain. This is just a constant, as far as I can tell, and there's never been a tool that supported splicing parts of existing ones together, which is my goal. With that in mind, the tedious process of creating from-scratch SRT files is best left to episodes that use 3 different aspect ratios and a lot of 2003 footage. Episodes 2 and 3 fit this bill, of course, so they get the full SRT treatment. Episodes 4, 5, and 6, on the other hand, were a different story. Given that I had copies of the show with hard-coded subtitles ran off to help wrangle the foreign language dub, I realized I could use this burned-in version as the basis of a subtitled release and save myself a lot of time. This costs double the space in terms of file size, but in practice, we're talking about like 500 megabytes per added video channel, and believe me, that was a cost plenty worth eating so I wouldn't have to make SRTs from scratch for every episode. The only issue this causes has to do with video splices, as sometimes lines from previous, now deleted scenes hang over into the next. These are pretty easy to fix though, just use the version without burnt-in subs for a bit and then switch back. They're all synced after all. And with that, I think I covered all the technical aspects from these episodes as in detail as I can justify. Next time, we'll cover episodes 7, 8, 9, and 10, what I broadly call the Lab 5 arc of FMABR. See you then. Oh, and the wait won't be as long this time, I swear.